Welcome to Internet Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Well, we're going to start out by talking. This past weekend, you did an interview with Robert David Steele that I think is going to probably get a lot of getting a lot of discussion around it. Already, we've had a pretty spirited debate on Twitter amongst some of our some people who follow our program and their views on this interview. But I think that once it comes out, for sure, it'll probably be the most viewed of anything we've done, and definitely looking forward to getting this interview out and getting the feedback out about it. Jeremy, real quick, do you want to go over some of the things that you and Robert talked about, and then after you give a little overview of some of the things that you and Robert discussed, we can talk about some of the issues surrounding the interview and some of the objections people may have to it, and go from there.
Yes, and I will work on being as thorough and clear and cogent as I can, even though I am currently a little bit disturbed. I still am, as far as I know, I think I'm still under indictment in the Kansas City Municipal Court in relationship to when you and I went to the Kansas City Public Library more than a year ago to, in good faith, participate in assembly, press, and then potentially speech in relationship to this Truman in Israel event. And it ended up major portions of the First Amendment were violated out in the open in front of hundreds of people. And then you were forced to leave the gathering, and just because you had courage to continue recording in the midst of serious security and police assault on our rights, we have a record of what actually happened there. And in the midst of that, you were ejected from the assembly and forced into turning off the camera as the arrest proceeded. And I was actually grabbed, assaulted in front of hundreds of people while at the microphone, following up in a good faith way about open source facts in relationship to Dennis Ross. And then ultimately the librarian of good faith who actually helped organize the event and did a lot of work to help bring it together and to help please the co-sponsors of the event, the Truman Library Institute and the Jewish Community Foundation of Kansas City. He also ended up being arrested and physically assaulted in the process. And Stephen Woolfolk, the librarian, he is also still under indictment at the same time as he and his library were getting awards from national library groups and those who are committed to the First Amendment and the work of libraries in the public sphere. We're giving them awards for acts of courage in defense of the principles of the library systems around the country and around the world, and specifically Steve's individual commitment and courage in the face of adversity. The charges are being escalated on him. So I am still, just this morning, getting emails about things about what's going on inside of the prosecutor's office, and I have had one charge just dropped, the actual originating charge, the trespassing charge, which was specious on its face. It was an event open to the public in a public place at the Kansas City Public Library, and the venue holder themselves, i.e. the Kansas City Public Library, had their own employee arrested because he was working to make sure that a patron was not being abused, and that those that had been allowed in terms of security, additional security to the event, were following the actual rules of conduct within a library and at a designated public forum event around things such as core political speech. So this is still in the mix. and trying to stay focused on continuing to defend myself and the importance of the First Amendment and the importance of core political speech surrounding things like false flag terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, specifically by criminal and treasonous elements of the U.S. and Israeli security states and beyond that. And so in the midst of all of that, this was a very interesting chance to interview Robert David Steele on Friday. And he is someone who I've paid attention to his work for a while now. And I was actually advocating for a ticket, a truly independent presidential ticket of McKinney and Steele back in 2015. And I thought that being that we looked like we were going to have some aspect of fake populists, some type of assets of a controlled change, such as people like Bernie Sanders on the left and then Donald Trump on the right, that I thought we needed a real approach to independent politics, to populist politics that are principled in nature. And I tried to think through who would be the best people that we have that have a background in public service and public policy and government involvement, who are on the public record in a courageous and visionary way around the things that matter. And those were the two people that I came up with, and so I was happy when I saw that they were beginning to work together in a close fashion in relationship to this sort of post-Trump era. And along the way, I was concerned about some of the statements that especially Steele was making, but also some of the analysis coming from Cynthia McKinney in relationship to Trump, and specifically that as you and I have continued to attempt to evolve our understanding and our analysis of our current political situation, it's become clear that you can't use singular terms such as the deep state or the establishment or these types of things. And so it becomes I think that a lot of people, including aspects of what Steele and McKinney have been saying in relationship to the Trump-Clinton battle, have been maybe a little bit simplistic in a way, and that it does look clear that aspects of some type of establishment faction and the deep state have been and continue to be against Trump. That appears to even include a good portion of the neocons. Now we've termed them the paleo neocons. Those that are believe that maybe the United States government should be in the driver's seat in terms of the Zio-American global imperial move in the 21st century under the guise of a fraudulent war of terror that was instigated by their so-called New Pearl Harbor. There was a full-on orchestrated black operation coming mainly from elements within the United States and Israel. And at the same time, they appear to be against these sort of paleo neoconservatives, whether it's the Robert Kagans, the Bill Kristols, the David Frums. These types of people are pretty clearly against Trump, I think, in a substantive fashion. But there's a whole other group of people who are clearly aligned with the so-called neoconservative agenda of a clash of civilizations, whether it's courteous and civilized, as maybe people like Peter Beinart would talk about in relationship to the paleo neocons, and how at least they weren't openly racist and and Islamophobic. But the new set of the new neocons, the neo-neocons, who have backed Trump, whether it's the Council on Security, what's it called? This Council on Security
Oh, you're
Policy.
talking about the Center for Security Policy. That would be Frank Gaffney's think tank.
That crew,
Gatestone Institute's another one
Gatestone Institute, the people
with John Bolton.
who's the other person you said?
Gatestone Institute is John Bolton, and of course you have to throw David Horowitz's groups in there as well. So.
Yes, and this crew in some way appears to, for whatever reason, be okay with fascist tendencies and open things like anti-religious bias and racism and a sort of a blatant clash of civilizations that's sort of parallel to the fraudulent war of terror. And this crew seems to be more not concerned about who's going to be in the driver's seat, apparently. And in many ways, many of them appear to be hooked into networks that want Tel Aviv to be in the driver's seat, and an axis where Tel Aviv is the man in the middle, working a new alliance that's in relationship to Russia, in relationship to Turkey, in relationship to aspects of Iran, and clearly still in relationship to a seditious, treasonous aspect of the U.S. Government. So that's been I've been trying to figure out the situation as we move forward. And so that was something that I was concerned about in relationship to what I've seen in coming from Steele, and he's been doing a lot of video interviews with people, and also McKinney's analysis on Twitter seems to be somewhat aligned with this, maybe a dualistic sense. I've seen it that they've labeled it as the Pilgrims versus the neocon Zionist American Empire or something like that. And I think that's not quite correct. I don't think that's correct, and I think there's a couple other missing pieces that need to be analyzed and dealt with. And so, in good faith manner, I wanted to have a conversation with Steele about that, and also certain statements that he made on the Alex Jones show that I remember being very concerned about when I heard them in terms of the timing. It seemed they were just about to launch Unrig in a substantial fashion and get out on the road, and Cynthia McKinney was coming into the country to participate in an event with Steele in St. Louis, and the main reason that I thought that this Unrig movement or program or advocacy was which is a net positive move, is because of its focus first and foremost on the idea of a real solution to election fraud, a real electoral reform act that Steele has been advocating for many years, actually. And he's always said, look, these are not my ideas, I am assembler of ideas. And so the launching of this Unrig program that has its primary focus on dealing with election fraud and putting Congress people on the record about it, and to try to force the hand of the Congress in putting forth this election reform act was I thought, a very wise, front and center, galvanizing, unifying, and deep issue that could lead to the kind of structural reform. So then the question, though, becomes, what is the politically pragmatic and wise way to approach that? And that then ties into this comment that Steele made on the Alex Jones show, talking about a 20 and back program to a secret space program to a Mars colony in relationship to essentially maybe kidnapped young people, or at least enlisted young people who he speculated, and he did couch it in the terms of "we believe that this is happening." And as it came in the midst of talk about pedophilia, justice in relationship to the Catholic Church, I believe, and someone who'd been caught within the Catholic Church, and then the launching of a public activist program based around something very grounded in easily and openly ascertainable facts about election fraud, these types of things, at best a highly speculative, or something that's based on some type of witness hearsay that cannot be proven either way by those seeking to do open source epistemology. I wouldn't say intelligence, but open source epistemology was troubling. Since then, it's been interesting. There was definitely when I heard it, I was like, oh man, I know that this is going to be jumped on by Media Matters to attack Alex Jones, of course, and of course, Media Matters never loses an opportunity to attack Alex Jones for the wrong things. But I sort of had a sense that was going to be happening, and then also I was concerned about how this was going to fall out on Cynthia McKinney's relationship to Steele and the Unrig campaign, and then the larger Unrig campaign. But my sense has always been that I'm mixed in terms of my own motivations in relationship to public discourse and politics and analysis, and that one of the reasons why I got involved in the 9/11 Truth movement, even though looking at it and looking back on it, there are definitely aspects of the 9/11 Truth movement that look to have been set up as some type of corralling, controlling operation that includes aspects of discrediting, red herrings, but also containment around very specific lines of evidence that led through the controlled demolition of the towers in Manhattan into the Zionists, security mob types surrounding that, and back into Tel Aviv and aspects of Israeli military intelligence that look like that was being that was a key control point in relationship to the 9/11 Truth movement. And I think I've seen that more and more clearly as my understanding and analysis has progressed, even though I understood aspects of that at the time when I was involved in doing activism in relationship with the 9/11 Truth movement, in relationship to We Are Change LA. I did always have I would speak my mind when things like the way that we would talk about September 11th, like the phrase of inside job always struck me as a minimizing and potentially a controlling lexicon. It sort of makes it sound like a bank job, and then of course it made it seem like it was the U.S. government and Total, even going into implied aspects of like the post office or that type of thing, and minimizing the clear and present substantive role of Zionist networks that tie into an actual foreign government's military apparatus in terms of Israel. And then, of course, that's not the end of it, but it was clear that people were using the Saudi connections and the Pakistani alleged connections, and even I had Bob Baer try to float the Iran connections to us, and that very much looked like red herrings, limited hangouts at best. And other things that I was suspicious of in relationship to the activism surrounding September 11th Truth was things like the things that sort of hinted at a sort of culty type of approach, where it was all about the black shirts and the talking about sheeple and this type of thing. At the very least was distasteful to me, and I also expressed that I believed it to be not strategic. At the same time, as I worked with a lot of really good people, I met my wonderful wife Lori in relationship to doing activism out in the public. And there's something about doing activism that is, to me, is a different sphere than doing pure analysis. And that it's a little bit rougher in a way. It doesn't mean that that truth and honesty are not as important or even more important, especially if you're in the realm of things where the truth of the matter and honesty about it is so obviously important, whether it's things like false flag terrorism, September 11th, or things like election reform and election fraud and these types of things. There's many, many ways to get caught into discrediting avenues of investigation or dead ends or red herrings or these types of things. And at the same time, part of my tolerance, let me say, I guess I would put it, and compassion, and also in relationship to even my own activist self, in relationship to my analyst self, is that we also need a political program and strategy about how we're going to apply the truth with power. And of course, this is why I've been interested in the realm of satyagraha, of Gandhi and King. More and more, I've learned, aspects of, of a critical approach to people like Gandhi and King, but overall,
For sure.
I understand the power of the idea of a satyagraha, which people might want to go look at an interview that I did with Reverend James Lawson, who was actually a mentor of sorts to Dr. King in relationship to nonviolence.
Is this video on YouTube, by the way?
Yes, that video is on my YouTube channel, Jeremy Rothkushel, on YouTube.
We'll link to it in the show description.
And it's interesting, just a side note, is that in relationship to this Kansas City Public Library arrest issue, when aspects of press started coming after we forced the issue in many ways to try to get the press to cover it, because there was almost complete silence all throughout this last summer after these arrests. And you would think with hundreds and hundreds of people, many of them connected in the Kansas City networks, that someone would have reported on this. A librarian and a patron being arrested mid-sentence, basically, in the middle of a high profile event about controversial subjects such as Truman and Israel, with a controversial figure such as someone we're operating out of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy like Dennis Ross coming to make the pitch that no matter its problems, that Israel was the only government in the Middle East that had a respect for women's rights, for speech and assembly, and for gay people's rights, and then right after that, a few minutes after that, it was basically low-level, some type of low-level civil-based, state-sponsored, because there were police involved, state-sponsored terrorist action against peaceful civilians, such as a librarian and a patron, over political speech. And so the height of irony and the obvious importance of this kind of assault, in de facto seditious assault on core aspects of the First Amendment, was not being covered. So we've forced the issue. And I guess my point was that there was one of the local newspapers in Kansas City, The Pitch. I spoke to the journalist. Actually, I was up with Professor Hall, who had invited me to come be with him in solidarity and aid when he was being ejected from his classroom because the B'nai B'rith Canada had pushed and done a pretty defamatory public campaign against him to push on his administration to take him out of the classroom, which they did. And I was up there with him at the same time as the press. He was starting to do press around that, and then the reporters were starting to do press around our experience at the library. And this journalist at the pitch in Kansas City, I pointed him to that I'm a documentarian. I make videos that have to do with things like asking about important matters that are sometimes controversial, and I pointed him to this interview with Reverend James Lawson, talking about, because it encapsulated the core of what I believe is the reason for doing truth-based activism. That it has to do with the truth having force, having peaceful, powerful force in the world in relationship to pursuing justice, peace, and freedom, and dignity, I would add. And he ended up just mentioning a video where I confronted Christopher Hitchens on his way to do a debate with a rabbi in L.A., David Wolpe, I think, about religion, where I asked him when he was going to stop pushing the lie of Bush and the neocons. And he did a tongue-in-cheek response to me where he said, "When the checks stop coming." And so this journalist included that rather than the interview with Reverend James Lawson, and because of course all of the Hitchens heads missed the fact that I understood that Hitchens was not just blatantly admitting that he was paid off, but there was tongue-in-cheek and making fun of the so-called conspiratorial mind state. And at the same time, I was pointing out that sometimes the truth can either be leaked or can be sort of subconsciously pushed in relationship to apparent irony. And it is the case that, of course, Hitchens enjoyed the paychecks coming from Condé Nast and his closeness to the Washington, D.C. elite, including his asking Michael Chertoff to swear him in as a citizen, including his acceptance of the invitation by Paul Wolfowitz to come visit him in the Pentagon to talk about the Iraq War and how they were going to pull it off in an effective way and why it was necessary. So that's a tangent, but I just wanted to bring that up in relationship to this idea that the question of how do you turn truth into justice, peace, freedom, and dignity is a key question. And it is another aspect of things about aspects of truth movement and 9/11 truth and these types of things, is that there are ways which it can slip into something like a paralysis, an analysis paralysis at best, or sort of pornography of knowing, or of a conspiratorial understanding towards the worst. And my point always in relationship to the 9/11 truth movement was that this seemed to me, I always described it as a combination of the philosopher's stone of understanding deep politics in some way, combined with the Achilles heel of the empire and imperial forces. And I still believe that's true to this day. And so that's sort of the questions and the struggles that are in my mind in relationship to something like Unrig and someone like Robert David Steele, who I am not, even though I was very uncomfortable and thought it potentially unwise to be bringing up this hearsay analysis about secret space programs and its relationship with child abduction and enlistment and that type of thing. I also have a higher tolerance for someone like him for misstatements, potentially bad statements, incorrect statements, because of his background as a very, very wide aggregator and coalescer of actionable knowledge. And then Miss McKinney, of course, has of any politician, of any elected official in North America, I would say, at the very least in the 21st century, she is the one who, when it mattered, put certain people on the record about very, very important, difficult subjects such as September 11th and things like trafficking, human trafficking in relationship to Donald Rumsfeld, 9/11, DynCorp, this type of thing. And then I guess the last piece of this preamble is that I look for people who progress. I look for that in myself. Where we are willing to admit we don't have all of the information. We could be wrong about not only our interpretations, but we could be wrong about certain facts that we think we know are the case. And that the most important thing is to stand on what we know and assert it in a way that can be used to move towards justice, and so that people who begin to progress in their analysis, in my perspective, are people like Steele and McKinney. When they keep moving forward, it looks like to me, in terms of their understanding. And so that's something that I am very committed to, is this idea of us continuing to progress, be willing to be humble in relationship to asserting what we know or do not know to be true. And I imagine that this is most interesting or vitally important in relationship to something like subjects around high-level pedophilia, and also subjects such as black technology, secret space programs, shadow technologies and parallel civilizations, these types of things. So that's sort of my mind state. And so I did this interview with Steele, and I wanted to bring up some of not only my concerns, but also some of my reasons and praise for the actual activism that he and Cynthia McKinney were helping lead the way on. So that was some of what I wanted to go into. I didn't get everything on the record that I wanted to in relationship with Steele, especially around Trump and the alt-right, and the indicators that this was that Trump is a asset of one of the deep states, let's put it like that, and most specifically
Indeed.
the deep Jewish state, as I termed it and presented it to Steele. And I don't think that we really got to any further clarification about these disagreements, these problems, and so I think follow-up conversation is important and necessary. And I would ask people to err on the side of having conversations, continuing to have critical debates, critical conversations, rather than writing people off immediately as disinformation shills and that type of thing, at the same time as being critically aware that this type of scenario is very, very possible. And of course, I think it's very fair that someone with a background in as a spook in intelligence, like Robert David Steele, I think it's fair and proper for there to be a higher level of scrutiny in relationship to things that can be perceived and act as potential mis or disinformation. So I would ask him to further engage in this conversation in relationship to that. So maybe we should just go quickly through some of the things that got talked about in this interview and do some analysis of that. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Now, that sounds great. Thank you for breaking that down and getting into the reasons for doing the interview. And it makes a lot of sense, because I'll say I personally, I haven't known about Steele as long as you have. I know you've been aware of him a lot longer than I have. Obviously, I've known who Cynthia McKinney is for a long time, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. I'll say I fall more on the side that is very extremely wary, to the point of, I would say, probably being distrustful of someone like Steele based on a lot of his statements. But I appreciate the way you went about doing the interview, because Steele's never been asked these questions in a public. There's never been a public forum where he's been asked these questions. So it was great at the very least to get his perspective on these questions and get things out there to him in a way that you probably would not have been able to get him on the record to even talk about these things, or much less even have these questions asked to him if you had gone about this in a belligerent manner. So definitely we did this. This was beneficial to have this interview done the way you did it for no reason other than that. And I'll say, despite my suspicions of him, it's still, I believe he should get a fair hearing on these matters, and that's what we did. And now, in the future, if people want to follow up on this, and I know we would like to follow up on this if we can, in the future, if Robert David Steele continues to give the kind of answers or lack thereof and answers to the really big questions that you gave him, then in the future, though, this could be addressed in perhaps a different manner or a different tone where we'll have a more definitive conclusion to make. But on the topic of with Robert David Steele, what gets me is, even before I heard his comment about the Mars program and some of the things he said, and by the way, during the interview, you asked him about that, and he made a comment along the lines of there had been a caller on the show prior to him making that statement that had referenced the space program. I went back and I checked the interview, and there was no caller who had mentioned the space program. So I don't know if on that part, if he just got it wrong or if that was a deliberate omission on his part. But there was no caller who talked about the space program. There was a call about pedophilia prior to the comment he made, but there was no call about the space program. So wanted to clarify that. But my concerns with Steele, even before I even heard this comment about Mars or whatever on the Alex Jones show, it was more or less what he would not talk about rather than what he would talk about. And with me, it's kind of odd. The first time I ever heard of Robert David Steele actually was earlier this year, and it was an interview he did on the Richie Allen show, and he had made an allegation, I think, that one of the Rothschilds, Lynn Rothschild, had offered Trump like a $20 million bribe to, or might even been, I think it was somewhere in that area, to basically sell out, and how I think his conclusion was that Trump basically wasn't playing ball with it, and that he's a real man of the people. And from there I started listening a little more to Steele, and it's odd in his analysis of things, where he seems to really have a very good understanding of, say, what the Clintons are about, say what a lot of these other figures in the administration is about, although I question some of his claims about, for example, his claim that Mike Flynn was ousted because of he had blackmail information on one of Mike Pence's friends being involved in trafficking-related issues. But despite that, Steele has a grasp of a lot of these figures and how they work and how the quote deep state operates. But when it comes to Donald Trump, and when it comes to people who are closely affiliated with Donald Trump, people like Steve Bannon and various others who we have identified as being involved with this, what appears to be this hardcore right-wing Zionist network under the guise of nationalism, which appears to have been the key factor in getting Donald Trump elected, all of a sudden Steele's analysis and critical analysis just goes out the window. So I've always been suspicious of that, and it seems that where the rubber hits the road for him is when you bring up Donald Trump's actual connections and who Trump's been connected to his entire life, the Roy Cohn network later on, and then getting into the whole Resorts International, the mafia aspect of the global power structure, you could call it, which definitely has its tentacles in New York City, where he made his fortune and the majority of his casino empire coming from the CIA Mossad front group. Resorts International is documented by Michael Collins Piper. And then his actions even in New York City and his Trump Soho Manhattan property with the, quote, Russian gangsters such as Felix Sater and Tawfiq Arif and others. And these are areas where there is no analysis of this stuff from a Robert David Steele. So I was pretty suspicious of that. So my concerns with him were more to do with what he doesn't talk about. And I got to say that this Mars comment and then this interview with him that you conducted personally for me has not really done anything to to decrease my suspicions of him or to increase my trusting of him in any way. But some of the questions that you went into that he particularly his answers were particularly interesting, or lack thereof. I remember you had asked him about basically asked him a question about the Roy Cohn mob and then moving up into the alt-right and the Breitbart network. And I don't remember his exact response, but it was a very waffling answer. Like, I think he quickly ended up moving the back into another topic. Do you remember the answer he gave to that particular question that you had asked regarding this is before you asked him about the possibility of election fraud. You had asked him about Trump's connections to these mob figures and Breitbart Zionist connections. Do you remember the specific answer he gave?
Yes, and I think I'd put it in a way about how Trump was clearly in these networks or at the very least knew about these networks and was involved in relationship to someone like Epstein, and Steele sort of spun it as that Of course, Trump is smart and he does know about this, and it's likely or something. It's in the realm of that he has tried to keep himself from being compromised, and I think he may said or maybe not.
I think if I recall, it was something about having money and not needing, and not having access to all the women he'd want because he has money and he doesn't have to resort to those kind of tactics. Something like that, actually.
That's true, right? And so that begs the question in relationship to Trump and the issue of sexual trafficking in relationship to some of these underage girl networks, in relationship to the modeling industry, in relationship to beauty pageants. And there are a lot of stories where Trump is in the mix in relationship to the parties and with sort of the bigwigs in New York City, with underage girls and cocaine, and so what Trump did or did not do, we don't have enough information to say either way. The way he's conducted himself in public, though, in relationship to making really inappropriate comments to girls who are 10, maybe, or his very inappropriate at best parent relationship with his daughter, Ivanka, and also his political conduct suggests that there is compromise there. And the chatter that I've heard is that he is compromised through the Epstein network, and someone like Eisenberg and his willingness to be very close to him and put him in key positions in the transition, and then afterwards as I believe an ambassador. I don't know if that got okayed. Is Eisenberg the ambassador to Italy? I don't know, but what the chatter that I've seen going around is that this is a place of compromise around Trump, and this is something that many people thought through in relation, before the election.
As of a few weeks ago, he's still. Oh, I was going to say with regards to Eisenberg, as of a few weeks ago, has not been made official. As of a few weeks ago, as of July 10th, 2017, Reuters article: Trump to nominate Louis Eisenberg to be ambassador. So I don't think that has been finalized yet.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I don't know what's happened with that. And
interestingly, also, is how that affects the potential relationship with the Vatican. We don't know. And also, I believe Newt Gingrich's wife has been named as nominated as ambassador to the Vatican. So those two figures being there with all this stuff going on with the Vatican and some of the revelations of sexual criminality in the Vatican higher ranks as of late. So that'll be interesting to see how that's handled with all the talk from the pro-Trump alternative media about that.
And I've thought about and had conversations with people in relationship to, this Epstein thing was always very clearly highly instructive of the compromise and the criminality of this whole set that was running for president in terms of Clintons and Trump. And at the same time, I could understand the argument of the Clintons have a history, on the record history, in relationship to Bill Clinton's administration's sanctions on Iraq and his war making towards the end that ended up killing thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people. There's the obvious problematic questions of the Clinton body count in relationship to not only the 80s CIA drug running through Arkansas, but many other things. And then, of course, the Clintons looked like Bill Clinton was much more contemporaneously involved with Epstein in terms of the amount of trips on the Lolita Express, the fact that Epstein had claimed that he had helped start the Clinton Foundation, and there are indicators that both of the Clintons are involved in sexual deviancy, sexual criminality, very likely, and so that seemed to be a very high level of that. Trump, although he's clearly been involved in these networks going way back, whether it's his relationship with Roy Cohn, who has been identified by James Rothstein, who actually spoke with him and investigated him as having actually run blackmail operations of underage children. I believe it was mainly boys that he operated in relationship to. And supposedly his explanation is this was for the greater good and compromising the communist traitors in the midst. And so this of course has played into the issue of Trump is a sleeper agent for the Bircher Society, and the way that even at some point Roger Stone and Alex Jones decided to almost try to revivify or reconstruct, make a very strong apologia for Roy Cohn in Trump's background, but in large part they sort of avoided it. My main issue here is that in relationship to this issue of Trump and Epstein and the obvious relationship of the Epstein cell back into Mossad, Israeli intelligence networks, that in conjunction with what is the alt-right? Is the alt-right a completely manufactured, controlled opposition? And then also the questions about how can one say either way that this past election was somehow not actually criminally hacked or rigged in a material fashion, just because supposedly there was a countermanding or a counter-rigging stand-down by what Steele claims was forces on behalf of Clinton to try to rig the election, and they were stopped by elements within Homeland Security. Whether or not that is actually the truth and whether that's plausible still begs the question of who did that, and are they actually just sort of American first patriots, or, as is shown by some of the psychographical warfare surrounding Trump and in relationship to the Mercer Network and Breitbart and Cambridge Analytica, and this whole scenario that Trump actually was hoisted on the American people in a highly tuned psyops fashion. And then, of course, if someone's going to do that, then they might even go the full route of then hacking the election. And so this is still something that both Steele and McKinney, I believe, need to address. The question of, and I did some of this research, that the people who try to debunk the idea of Hillary Clinton's actually rigging the election against the primary against Bernie Sanders point out that it looked like the places where Clinton had an advantage was in places with Republican governors. And so the people attempting to debunk this theory say, well, then that's obviously not the case, so it couldn't have been rigged because the only motive would have been through the Democratic Party, and it would have showed itself in relationship to the Democratic governors. However, if you actually consider the possibility that it was actually Hillary Clinton that was set up to be the straw woman to allow for a plausible victory by a Donald Trump, who has high negatives in relationship to perspectives of substantial portions of the American population, then you might see, there might be other parties. Maybe the parties that actually back Trump might be the ones who would want to put in Clinton over Bernie Sanders. And that makes a lot of sense. That makes a ton of logic, because almost everyone admits, maybe not some of the sort of hardcore Trump bots, but most everybody's willing to concede that at the very least Bernie Sanders would have given Donald Trump a run for his money, if not incredibly destroyed him potentially in the general election.
We also can't forget that it was within the DNC emails, the Pied Piper strategy was leaked out, which mentioned Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, and Donald Trump as the 3 GOP candidates who should be propped up by elements within the DNC because they were being perceived as potential. Not only would they be perceived as potential easy opponents, but I guess also they were considered as just being better candidates for the Democrats to run against in general. And I believe Bev Harris pointed that out on the Alex Jones show with Roger Stone sitting in studio with Alex. I don't think she's been on the show since. So
good, that's a good point. So that I would like to hear Bev Harris interviewed in a more contemporary fashion about all of that. And I think that's a good point, pointing out the Pied Piper strategy, because in a parallel fashion, you can see in terms of a high-level intelligence type operation, it relates to something like September 11th, where, of course, in the background you have the Al-Qaeda network, the database, the intelligence lists of Takfiri Wahhabist groups that are being managed globally. You have the Bojinka plot, and then you also have some of the patsies that are ultimately living in the United States, and so that it needs to be managed as a part and parcel of an intelligence plot. That doesn't mean, and actually once you begin to see the higher order authorship, the construction of the actual military operation in something like a September 11th, or let's say the installation of a president, then you can see that something like taking advantage or maintaining the construct of something like an Al-Qaeda in parallel to the DNC's Pied Piper strategy then becomes either hijacked or more logically, it becomes utilized at a higher level of construct and to actually pursue the military operation. And this, of course, then ties into, and I pointed this out with Steele, and he sort of blew off the significance of Cambridge Analytica. But of course, the background of Cambridge Analytica is in a British-born, it looks like, tied directly into some of the intelligence-related academy, Cambridge University circles of a globally operating military electoral so-called management operation. And I forget what it's called, SCL or something like that. The parent group of Cambridge Analytica. And so I think to dismiss the power of psychographical warfare, the involvement of the Mercer network of Cambridge Analytica would be unwise at best.
It's the SCL group, by the way, SCL group.
The SCL group. So it could be seen, and of course we need to be able to have these conversations without it becoming a scenario of, well, what do you want? Did you want Clinton?
Yeah. On the topic of Cambridge Analytica, I think we're going to be revisiting a topic related to this when we get into this article that Peter Beinart wrote about the shift in within the Republican establishment from just in terms of its attitudes, and it's shifting to the right in terms of attitudes and sentiment. So I think we might be revisiting this topic here in a little while.
Yes, and so then the problematic question of sort of asserting or proclaiming that Trump has somehow kept himself clean of these compromised networks or was not involved with them. It's sort of like trying to prove a negative. It can't be done at some level. And at the same time, his closeness with these networks, that includes the Eisenberg network, of course, right? Eisenberg, Michael Glassner, the whole crew surrounding the World Trade Center demolitions on September 11th, and a lot of their backing of Trump. And of course, there's the Silverstein Netanyahu weekly Sunday call, and of course there's the Breitbart, i.e. Bannon, also, maybe before Bannon was involved, but it seems to have only gotten more intense, this relationship with the Netanyahu faction in Israel in relationship to Breitbart. And then I also pointed out that Mercer had a background in attempting to take out Congressman Peter DeFazio over an important tax solution, and which is a part of a plank that I believe Steele supports, which is a financial transaction tax related to the idea of a Tobin tax that could have the potential of replacing income tax with the taxing of rapid trades at high levels, and getting back some of our resources from the top 0.1 of 1%. And Mercer played a role in trying to take out DeFazio and this very highly patriotic, highly powerful solution, a tax solution, to what could ultimately replace and overthrow the treasonous Federal Reserve combo in relationship to the IRS and the what I believe is unlawful shaking down by our public sector of the private individuals that sit above this. And these are things that I think should be on the table, and I just brought it up to show that Mercer is a player here, and he's in a direct opposition. He's been politically showed his hand to be in direct opposition to the type of things that Unrig and Steele specifically, I believe, are trying to get onto the table in support of. So I think we should not write off the significance of Cambridge Analytica. Increasingly, I believe it's more and more important to understand the issue of psychographical warfare, especially in relationship to the deepest aspect of, or one of the deepest aspects of the Unrig campaign that I support, and that I expressed this to Steele too, that the idea of an actual big tent politically, and I put this in contradiction or in distinction to a precise table analytically. That we actually have to have a real transpartisan, total, full spectrum political conversation with all of good faith at the table. That's one thing, and I think that Unrig has the potential to actually do that if it can progress itself analytically in relationship to these more disturbing questions about Trump and the alt-right networks and the Mercer, Breitbart, Bannon circles in relationship to that. And then the other is the idea of distributed direct democratic activism, nonviolent democratic activism, that Unrig is seeking to create a situation where there are 435 different groups being led by local people on the ground, where the unification only comes in relationship to these very specific calls, such as serious election reform, and now they've added, which I believe is a very important piece, a question about where Congress's loyalty lies. Does it lie to Israel and the AIPAC pledge that Cynthia McKinney has exposed, or does it lie with the American people and a real idea of America first in an enlightened fashion? So the combination of those two is where I believe that there is a lot of potential here in relationship to unrig. And I also laid out a few of my own proposals and political philosophical concepts in relationship to what I see as advancing the political dialogue surrounding this, because I think that there is a lot to the idea of having a conversation across the political spectrum. But
Yes,
it needs to
I
be
agree.
done with frameworks that are allow us to understand each other and understand where our actual disagreements are and where our actual misunderstandings of each other's motivations are. And so that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is that I don't think analysis of the problem is enough, and that we need to have an actual strategic and principally pragmatic position about a political vision. And I know I want that. I know I have ideas about that. And I think it is the case that the way that we don't get caught in the stagnant places of sort of either conspiracy pornography or analysis paralysis is by having conversations about our vision and how we're going to get there out in the public. And at the same time, learn how to have critical disagreements out in the public
Yes.
in a way that's we can begin to ferret out those of bad faith, while at the same time not disparaging those of good faith, and bringing each other into constructive dialogical conversational folds.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's I laid out some of that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that, and with regards to Steele, I think that with people like this, normally, I think that the truth will come out over time. I think, and we'll be able to figure out. I think after this interview, when we see him in action in the future, well, I think we'll be able to get a much better, I think, grasp of what he actually represents, as opposed to what he may not. But the fact is, though, is that we did get him on the record with these questions, and regardless of how much he waffled around them, at the very least, now he's heard these questions. So the next time he's asked, really, I think it'll be more difficult to feign ignorance of these obvious connections that Donald Trump has, and the continued kind of playing dumb that he does about and pretending like these connections don't exist, or he doesn't know anything about them, or that there's no evidence to possibly say that there were forces behind Trump that were just as influential and just as powerful within the so-called deep state, which has been falsely represented as only representing the Obama, Clinton holdovers, as well as those of the establishment who appear to be, I think, very genuinely against Donald Trump and what the movement around Donald Trump represents, and what we've identified as perhaps this power play on behalf of hard right-wing Zionists. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, but anyways, thanks for doing that interview, and thanks for giving the perspective of why you did it the way you did, and welcome everybody to listen to it and to come to their own conclusions about it. But we just wanted to really get on the record this interview and why it happened, and why he approached it the way he did. So thank you for doing that, Jeremy.
For sure.
And
There's one last thing I want to just mention, because I wanted to bring this up with Steele, is that in terms of my understanding of a Gandhian approach, putting aside questions about the strategic, agreement about that approach, part of that is that Gandhi would do things where he would give his political nemesis the best faith understanding that he could. And have conversation and address them in public in a way where they were not immediately termed a nemesis or a political opponent or enemy. And at the same time, there's an attempt, he would attempt to have a weigh in on their thinking in a maybe more private fashion, and try to have a conversation with them. And so in some ways, in a good faith, I can see in the way that of any single Trump supporter or voter, that Robert David Steele is the one who actually fulfilled that step by step. And I understand the idea that, okay, that sort of begins to look like naivete at best at some level in relationship to a Trump, when Trump does not start taking on things like real election reform and instead starts an election integrity panel based on people who are familiar with voter suppression and potentially in some cases in election fraud. That then begins to say, okay, Trump is not going to be taking on the mantle of the we the people's real political election revolution and unrig, and but Steele gave him every opportunity to do that on the record with an attempt to get his letter, his memo to the president into Trump's hands, and Steele asserts that it made its way despite people like Bannon and Priebus and these people trying to allegedly stop Trump from seeing it. And Trump has done with it what he will. He has not decided to step up and lead the election reform movement and real election integrity. He's actually doubled down on partisanship fraud in relationship to all of this. And so that more than begs the question about whether the people who installed Trump are the ones that he is now, no matter level of willingness, he's now serving them. And but at the same time, Steele can credibly show that he did his best to be a good faith, loyal supporter of what he thought he was going to get in relationship to Donald Trump. And last thing is that we also went over, and I asked him to make it clear that the framing, the actual political framing of unrig is the phrase beyond Trump and Sanders. And you hear Steele on the record saying things like "God bless Donald Trump," and although I have problem with I'm open to every soul is sacred, and even the people who do wickedness they can also be saved, and they can do right, and their souls are important. But God blessing a man who's now killing thousands of or at least hundreds of civilians and escalating that type of murderous activity is increasingly unwise and unprincipled. At the same time, I understand Steele then qualifies that statement, the God bless Donald Trump, by saying, at the very least, Trump and Sanders, who's also a fraud. And Steele did the same thing with Sanders, where he reached out to Sanders even before reaching out to Donald Trump, I believe, and attempted to inform and push and lobby Sanders to actually fulfill election reform and an election reform act that would have actually allowed Sanders to claim his victory over Hillary Clinton if he had done so. But of course, Sanders rejected that, and Sanders also failed to claim his victory in the primaries, showing him to be some kind of compromise fraud also. At the same time, this idea of the rigged system and a populism of we the people, and we can assert our right to politically and peacefully overthrow the treasonous establishment is the mood of the hour. And so thanking the Trump and Sanders, not only as individuals, but the wings of the political discourse for beginning to open up this conversation is the type of thing that I do appreciate, as long as it's actually beyond Trump and Sanders. And so the concerns about certain statements that Steele has made about how he may be sort of utilizing his relationship with Cynthia McKinney to deliver the black vote to Donald Trump and or maybe the Republicans in 2018 and 2020, Steele has made very clear statements against that being his stated reason, and saying that yes, if Donald Trump does not take this on, and then also if the Congress refuses to take on common sense electoral reform and common sense rejection of committing their loyalty to a foreign military power, one as engaged in aggressive spying and war making when it comes to 9/11 as Israel, then he and Miss McKinney are going to take the next step politically and work to organize to politically overcome all of those parties, including Trump administration. Well, so we will see, and I would say instead of just seeing, let's get involved, and whether it's in attempting to have these conversations with Steele and McKinney, or in starting local groups that begin to open up these types of activism strains and conversations, I think that's a good thing. And allowing people to evolve, the space to evolve their analysis. Even someone like as strong and courageous an analyst and activist as someone like Brendan O'Connell is moving very rapidly in terms of his evolving understanding of the geopolitical situation. He even, at one point supported Trump and didn't understand the Trump compromise, and he's making very, very quick evolution, maybe quicker than anybody in certain ways, and so I think we need to be able to have room for people to evolve themselves, and the most important thing is shows of public intellectual good faith and the willingness to engage in critical conversation.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm glad you threw that in there at the end. O'Connell's a great example of evolving as you learn more. But with Steele, I think time's going to reveal itself here, and we're going to keep a very, 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 very close eye on Robert David Steele and watch how he conducts himself in the future, what he says and what he does. Personally, I find his the whole idea of him reaching out to Trump, and one of the things that makes me more suspicious about him personally is that he seems to at least publicly convey this idea that everything would be okay if Trump would just listen to him. And he does let off a veneer of arrogance about it in some ways, where I can see people construing it that way. But I think we've talked enough about Steele. I think this is definitely a topic we're going to be revisiting more in the future, as we're going to continue to evaluate and watch and monitor his actions and his public statements very carefully. But this is a good segue into our next topic.
And just one last thing that I would urge people to go look at Steele's body of work, at least in a in a surface level fashion, to go look at the amount of books that he has digested and reviewed on Amazon, and also the nature of his compiling open source solution building that he has put on the record, and so that's ultimately why I believe that someone like him could contribute to the political principle and courage of someone like Cynthia McKinney, with both of their experience in actually working in the government, and help we the people to actually implement a large-scale, effective, and principled political solution. So I would just have people try to look at the sort of the broader scope of his work in order to give him a fair hearing on these more dubious statements.
Great point, Jeremy. Thanks for adding that. This makes a great segue into our next topic, and that is someone who who's done an interview with Robert David Steele, and in fact had this interview that she did with Robert David Steele used against her by some of her critics in something that has recently become a pretty big deal, much widely talked about within the ranks of the progressive left. Now we're moving from the pro-Trump to the left, and that is Caitlin Johnstone. Caitlin Johnstone is the Australian writer who writes her articles on the Medium website, who has been under fire over the last couple of months for advocating that progressives can form alliances with right-wingers. In particular, she cited Mike Cernovich as an example of a right-winger who some progressives could find common ground with on certain matters. And as a result of saying this, there's been a tremendous debate within the than the more progressive, I'd say the further left elements within the progressive movement. And it has been a very spirited one. She's had her share of detractors and her share of defenders, naturally. One of her biggest detractors is Counterpunch magazine, which has come out with several articles, counterpunch.com for the magazine, come out with several articles very, very strongly criticizing her and basically asking the question, how can we align ourselves with white supremacists and fascists and bigots and all these buzzwords that are used. And her response is, well, I'm not trying to align myself with these people. We can find common areas. I can condemn some of his views and still find areas of common ground with him. And my personal view on this, when we get outside of all of the infighting and the controversy surrounding it, all you're going to hear from different people is that I personally am against Mike aligning myself or working with Mike Cernovich for any reason at all. Like, I am absolutely opposed to this concept but it goes beyond ideology. I mean, because the argument that a lot of these progressives are making is that, we can't align with someone like Cernovich because his ideology is poisonous. And I would agree with that to a large extent. I do think his ideology is poisonous, but I think that this goes way beyond ideology, and it gets into matters of going way beyond that and the political ramifications of affiliating with people like Cernovich. And I also sense that there is at some level an anti-conspiratorial bent to all of this criticism that Johnstone has received. And I'm personally, I view Johnstone with a very skeptical eye, much like I do a Robert David Steele. She seems to be very, very interested in promoting herself and boosting herself and in getting attention off of this. I think she really enjoys the attention that comes with these articles and all this talk about her. And so I'm not trustful of her, and I'm certainly not advocating any sort of alliance with Cernovich, but I do think that this campaign against her has been extremely vitriolic. It is a really nasty campaign that's against her, and I do think that there might be some ulterior motives with some of the people who are and entities and outlets like Counterpunch that have been the most critical of her. And one of my major points is that a lot of these people that are coming out against Caitlin Johnstone, I'd say Benjamin Norton, it might be the most prominent example. I don't feel that they really have any room to be criticizing people for being bad progressives or for making anti-war causes and watering down and diluting anti-war causes when you consider Norton and, of course, his pal Max Blumenthal, who we've documented constantly on this program. We don't need to get into his record again. With their history of promoting regime change propaganda and other lies which benefit the, quote, deep state. And my standing has been that anybody who is going to come out and praise these people while condemning someone like Johnstone, I don't think they have any room to talk. But outside of that, I think that this is an overly vitriolic campaign against her, and I can't get the idea out of my mind, regardless of how much I disagree with her sentiments and actually am not trustful of a lot of the ways that she conducts herself, Miss Johnstone. I do think that there is at some level an ulterior motive to this campaign against her that goes beyond just intellectual and ideological purity on the left. And perhaps, Jeremy, you could give your thoughts on what some of those ulterior motives might be, as if they relate to this anti-conspiratorial bent, or whether it might be other things.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting moment. I'm happy that this conversation is taking place, no matter which way it's termed, whether it's the progressive civil war or the Twitter civil war on the left side. And I think there's a lot of there's not only a lot of grist for the mill, but there's some clarifications and some important disagreeing conversations that are now starting to place in relationship to this. And yeah, definitely fuck Mike Cernovich. But at the same time, to understand Caitlin Johnstone's argument on its face in a fair fashion, she is making a very fair point in relationship to picking out. She's what she said she's doing is she's working to pick out an example of the sort of most, what she finds as unsavory, maybe even politically despicable in certain ways, figure on the right, and showing how there's certain areas where politically in a strategic fashion that there are certain issues where there could be some type of not an alliance, or it's not a coalition, but a where there is a common political nemesis to work against, and I think that is a very fair point. The questions then that come up is, why is she being so intensely attacked by people who are even trying to minimize her in many ways, who are saying, well, who is she? She just came out of nowhere. Where's her background? Where's her leftist Marxist academic lineage? Where is her proof that she is not just all hot air? And the amount of the articles that just keep coming, they kept coming on the Counterpunch. It does suggest there's something else hanging in the background here, especially as there's this parallel and concurrent move by such people as Max Blumenthal and Glenn Greenwald to have a civil conversation and go, in the case of Max Blumenthal, go on the platform of Tucker Carlson to have a conversation about the Russian and red baiting that Max Blumenthal perceives. So this is pretty interesting, and these people who are writing these articles about Caitlin Johnstone appear to be focused on her, and her as some potentially, whether consciously or unconsciously, some type of counter-insurgent agent coming from being sent by someone trying to alt-rightify or neoliberalize the left by means of some type of compromising relationship, a political relationship with elements on the right. They are not focused on pointing out what is the actual the actual violently destructive coalition, let's say, an actual substantive coalition, and a consensus by groups such as, we could even add Mike Cernovich into this one too, but let's just say Tucker Carlson, Glenn Greenwald, and Max Blumenthal all are on the team of the war on terror is a reaction to some external attack by Arab Muslim young men on September 11th. And in this recent podcast on The Intercept, this came out very, very clearly in Glenn Greenwald's conversation with Tucker Carlson. And although Tucker Carlson has publicly made statements that he made a mistake in relationship to advocating for the war on Iraq, and in this conversation with Glenn Greenwald, he actually filled in some of the backstory in a sort of shadowy way, that there was some some governmental figure that he knew from a previous wife that had convinced him that Saddam Hussein was an actual threat to the United States of America, and that's why he supported it. And at the same time, as he says, we cannot be duped again, and this is also in a time span where another key interaction that Tucker Carlson had on his program besides Max Blumenthal was his conversation with Max Boot, a paleo neocon. At the same time as Tucker Carlson says, I made a mistake on Iraq, he doubles down on Afghanistan. He says he would still support Afghanistan, but would ask questions about why we're still there. And Glenn Greenwald did not push back at all, as far as I remember, on that. And of course, both Glenn Greenwald, but more intensely Max Blumenthal, have an actual strong history of not only not being a good faith discussion of the open source facts that show September 11th and the war in Iraq and the ongoing war of terror as an actual program by the same forces, and forces that are very much in a line between New York, Washington, D.C., and Tel Aviv. No, they are not even willing to talk about those things. In fact, Glenn Greenwald's on the Twitter record almost in full denial of the fact that Israeli intelligence elements were arrested on September 11th. And of course, the record is even worse than Israeli intelligence elements celebrating. There is a record, an open source record, that involves the corporate media, including people like Dan Rather, reporting on Israeli intelligence, or I guess it was put as Middle Eastern nationals, in vans with explosives on September 11th, targeted, it looked like, at things like the George Washington Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel. So Glenn Greenwald is publicly in denial of very obvious facts about September 11th, especially those ones that point at elements from the Jewish state being heavily involved in this. And of course, Max Blumenthal, you've done really important work in analyzing Max Blumenthal's role in basically helping the stick equation, the disciplining of people on the left, such as people like Robbie and Abby Martin. And I've had personal experience with how dirty Max Blumenthal plays. He's sort of been part and parcel of having me removed from two events, and then said very obvious deceptive things about it after the fact on Pacifica radio airwaves after the fact. So I know him from personal experience to not be a good faith participant. Whether you could say, oh, he's actually scared of you. That's what he claimed to the bookstore when he had me removed preemptively from the bookstore for his open to the public book reading and signing. He said he told the bookstore that he believed I was a threat to him. And I've never made any physical threats. I've never even hinted that I was physically threatening Max Blumenthal. So it looks like that what the nature of the facts that I have ascertained and the logic that I have applied to them, and then the rhetorical production of that is really what the threat is to a Max Blumenthal. And so Max Blumenthal is an intense, aggressive character, trying to really subvert, but we can see a disciplining. He's sort of using the stick against elements of the left. Your article about Max Blumenthal finds Abby Martin not guilty of trutherism is a key one in this regard. So I think it's sort of interesting to see this happening concurrently, where Glenn Greenwald and Max Blumenthal are allowed to have these critical conversations with Tucker Carlson, who's still on the wrong side of history and the truth and justice and anti-racist political behavior around Afghanistan, and yet somehow a blogger from Australia, Caitlin Johnstone, who whether you like her conclusions or the nature of the way that she would go about it, is making a logical argument about why she did a thought experiment and real life example of work in relationship to Mike Cernovich. So what's really at play here, though, is much deeper than all of that. It really looks like that the reason that Caitlin Johnstone was actually such a threat to some of the elements coming out of the, coming into the counterpunch platform to really take her on, And I don't believe this is all of them, but it definitely looks like, in terms of what's behind some of this and the intensity around it, it looks like she's angered some people because she's talked about the nature of the left-wing propaganda around the Syria destabilization campaign. And pointing out the shifting, some of the shifting attitudes of certain people, that of course would include someone like Max Blumenthal. It looks like that issues of war and peace, and specifically the nature of information warfare and propaganda as deposited in the core of the controlled left in places such as Counterpunch at times, but also up through Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! is key to all of this. This is a place where the controlled left, much of it, I'll bet, goes back through foundation funding, but also intelligence agencies and their insertion of agents thereof. And this is something maybe we should talk about another time, but this is all part and parcel of a very, very high level of understanding that we need to attain in relationship to the problem of propaganda and psychological warfare, and also playing into this new understanding around psychographical warfare, which has to do with the nature of political association in relationship to one's own personal beliefs and political commitments and psychology. So this, I think, is really what's at play here. And so I think we should use this conversation as a time to begin to inject deeper and deeper truths that need to be dealt with by both so-called sides of this argument, that have to do with, let's keep coming back to false flag terrorism, September 11th. What is the role of the Zionist power configuration in not only helping pull it off, and more it looks like authorship is in foreign hands, in coming out of the Netanyahu factions in Israel, in conjunction with people like Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak, who are on the surface of a different political Zionist persuasion, but it looks like they agreed that this was the thing that needed to be done, in conjunction with certain elements of the U.S. that might not have Israel as their first concern, such as people like Dick Cheney. And those types of networks. So we need to keep focusing on that and dealing with that, because the other part about that is that the September 11th operation is ongoing. The ongoing cover-up is part of the September 11th operation. No one would try to pull something like that treasonously and murderously audacious without knowing that or at least thinking that they could control the narrative afterwards. And so that speaks to the treason of the controlled left in allowing this to go unchecked. And from the sedition of silence of Amy Goodman to the treasonous slander of Noam Chomsky, this needs to be dealt with. And then people like Abby Martin need to address this. And of course, that was one of the things that there was an uproar in certain circles about, was the way that Abby Martin, who had access to Noam Chomsky, treated him with kid gloves, as he's just a political ally. Fine, he may be a political ally in your eyes, but that's if you're a journalist and you know what you know about September 11th, and it's obviously an important event. There's ways of conducting an interview where you put the facts that have to be dealt with on the table and let the chips fall where they may. It doesn't mean you have to go with a bullhorn and bullhorn Amy Goodman in the middle of a lecture, or accuse Noam Chomsky of being a CIA or Zionist shill up to his face. But the hard questions, backed by the hard open source data, needs to be dealt with. So that I would urge people to do that. I've been calling up a couple times to the Benjamin Dixon show, who's on the side against the Caitlin Johnstones in this conversation, and attempting to create my own radical middle argument about the problem of the progressives and their weak at best analysis of what the actual deep states, let's use the let's start using the plural, the deep states involved in our modern political reality are doing, and that an analysis, a progressive analysis, has been failing on that. And of course, and knowing what we know, that failure is purposeful, it's intentional, it's done and held into place by people with certain platforms, such as Max Blumenthal, such as Glenn Greenwald. And so the folks who have a background in actually dealing with facts that touch deep into the core of the deep state, people such as Abby Martin, and also increasingly someone like Caitlin Johnstone, need to start talking about that. And I would point people to a conversation that I was able to instigate and help moderate to some extent back in 2010 at a Santa Cruz conference about deep politics. It's also on my YouTube channel, Jeremy Rothkushel YouTube channel, and it's one of the first videos that I posted, and it's a conversation between Barry Zwicker and Peter Phillips from Project Censored specifically about Noam Chomsky and the issues of how to deal with September 11th in a left circles, and specifically about how do you deal with people like Noam Chomsky, who have shown themselves to not be of good or not operating in good faith around basic historical facts around things like state-sponsored terrorism and deep state events and state crimes against democracy and state crimes against the mind. So go look at that, because I think those are the kind of conversations that need to start happening on the left. And I think this distraction, yes, okay, there's a credible conversation to have about Cernovich, his relationship to the alt-right, his relationship to his misogyny and apparent racist aspects, and then the big picture about how is he actually anti-war, is he actually anti-establishment. Those are important conversations to have, but what's missing in all of that, of course, is the left itself. Are there elements of severe supremacism, severe racism on the left that are working some type of control angle, that are working? And the obvious answer is yes. The whole agreement amongst the Mike Cernoviches, obviously too. Mike Cernoviches, the Tucker Carlsons, the Glenn Greenwalds, the Max Blumenthals around September 11th treason. And then also about the power of the Zionist networks that operate not just in relationship to the Israel lobby and trying to suppress boycott, divestment, sanctions, politics, although that's key, but also about how Zionist power operates in relationship to controlling the narrative around not only in the United States in relationship to Israel, but also about our own politics. 9/11 happened on American soil. And if there's any foreign government that was looked like it was involved in it, it's Israel. And somehow all of these people, let's say, obviously Glenn Greenwald, Max Blumenthal, these people are obviously critics of Israel, of Israeli policy, and yet none of them can even have there's nowhere where you can find that they've had a credible public conversation about the open source facts of the still most important singular event in the 21st century, and an event about which they continue to obfuscate and deceive about in a de facto fashion, in a way that's still continuing to get thousands and thousands of dark-skinned Semitic people killed around the world.
Yeah. Yes. Fantastic. When you add on top of that, I want to move away from this topic here pretty soon. But when you add on top of that the consequences of this, as troublesome of an individual as we obviously have identified Mike Cernovich to be, this goes way beyond just Mike Cernovich, because if we're right about this, of there being an element of anti-conspiracist thinking involved in this, in these efforts against Johnstone, then that will extend to people who have views who are nothing like Mike Cernovich, who do not present themselves in the reactionary, right-wing social, bigot on issues related to social policy and Zionism and all of that as Mike Cernovich is. It will extend to people like you and myself and various others who are out there, people like Kevin Barrett and Professor Tony Hall, who are putting a lot of these hard truths out there that other people won't talk about. And I mean, are we going to be lumped in as fascist with the Mike Cernovich from these ideological purists on the left who have these elements within this chorus that are against Johnstone, that are clearly, it appears, trying to control and police the rhetoric and the discourse and how the discourse goes, such as Counterpunch or a Benjamin Norton. And I noticed Max Blumenthal's keeping very quiet about this, probably because he realizes that calling out someone like Johnstone could backfire on him given his own history. But I'm sure he's involved at some level behind the scenes in what's going on in this effort here. But, if we allow these people to just condemn someone like a Caitlin Johnstone for simply even saying that we should work with someone like Mike Cernovich in any way, regardless of what her motives are, regardless of what Mike Cernovich represents that we've identified, it has much bigger consequences than just, we're trying to keep fascists and racists out of the conversation. It goes much further than that. Who will be considered a racist? If we start this precedent, who is going to be considered this? Who is going to be condemned for these reasons? Who is going to be considered that you cannot associate with? So these are questions we have to ask among ourselves, and also we have to. And also another thing that these people will do is they will try to portray Mike Cernovich as the face of conspiracy theory, and this is something where, and I focus a lot on the Martins, Robbie and Abby Martin, but this is an area where Robbie Martin just, I think he's correct, but he's also incorrect in that he rightly identifies InfoWars and Alex Jones, the whole Alex Jones spear, as being a negative influence as far as conspiracy culture goes, and as far as the whole idea of exposing false flags and exposing power structures and all that. Obviously, InfoWars is a very bad example of that now. It has become an increasingly worse example of how to represent, how to expose these issues over time. But also, someone like Robbie Martin will join an avowed anti-conspiracy theorist such as a Max Blumenthal or a Ben Norton or a countless number of other people as portraying InfoWars as being representative of what most conspiracy theorists think, where anytime you have something that you want to dismiss or that you don't want to address, you can just lump it in with InfoWars, or you could lump it in with what they perceive to be legitimate anti-Semitism. So, and in the case, I won't name names, but there are a lot of people on the left will mock the idea of that there is an involvement by people such as George Soros or members of prominent banking dynasties such as the Rothschild family or the Rockefeller family, in potential involvement in wanting to bring refugees into Europe when they'll just dismiss that as just being nuttery, kookery, and just rooted in racism, when in fact, when you really look at a lot of the underlying facts that are out there about the refugee crisis and the migrant crisis, there is definitely a hidden hand playing a role in this. And you can expose that without getting into just nativist rhetoric and demonizing refugees and Muslims, and you can expose this, but are the people who are exposing this, who are shedding light on this role of these entities behind the scenes in creating a refugee crisis to destabilize Europe and divide Europe based on cultural lines and based on social lines, are the people who are presenting this information with credibility, who are not resorting to all of this nativist rhetoric, are they going to be lumped in with the racist and the fascist by the Benjamin Nortons of this world? These are questions that I think we need to ask among ourselves. So we got to be careful when if we're going to make sure that when we criticize Caitlin Johnstone, when we criticize this allegiance with Mike Cernovich, that we do it for the right reasons, that we shed light on this that goes beyond just a reaction to Mike Cernovich and a lot of his ideological views, and we actually have a deeper conversation about the ramifications of what this means and what this represents.
I very much agree with that, and there is something about this where there is an attempt by aspects of the left to avoid their own complicity in allowing for very racist, elitist conspiracies to be allowed to go unchecked, such as the war of terror. And then you pointed out things about analysis that involve things like the banking system. That includes small groups of families in relationship to who actually pulls the strings on the origins of the modern banking system. And yes, the aspects of the left have a good critique, I believe, of what they see as conspiratorial thinking and this sort of a myopic or sort of small view of just talking about that what they see is happening on the right, of people talking about Soros and Jacob Rothschild in a room and and flicking their fingers and tapping cigars and these type of things. And there is an aspect about that is correct in terms of its criticism of parts of what might be termed conspiratorial thinking. At the same time, there are facts that need to be dealt with that involve relationships of certain networks, certain family power. And then, of course, this is also tied very much in to the idea of white supremacism, which is a key pillar of what the principled left is against. And yet, you're not even allowed to talk about the possibility of something like Jewish supremacism. And that immediately gets you labeled as somehow in bed with Jew haters. And of course the right, there's elements of the right that would say if you talk about white supremacism, then you are a white hater. But it's not true. You can do a critical analysis of power that has certain ethnic dynamics. And in the case of Jewish power, it's a little bit more confusing because it's not only there's this sort of strange approach to ethnic claims, but there's also a very obvious religious claims. And although people like Max Blumenthal want to try to just depict Israel as just another example of white settler colonialism, which in some cases it does explain some of it in terms of the power structure is obviously Eurasian, mainly Eurasian Jews who are in most of the power positions in relationship to suppressing darker skinned indigenous people in relationship to that. But there's another part of that, another part of the issue of the Jewish state and Israeli power dynamics that is based on some type of ethno-religious supremacism that is qualitatively is different. It's its own unique situation from what you might call as white supremacism or European power or something like that. It's related to that. It's in conjunction. In many cases, it's in the prime mover position, but it's its own scenario that needs to be unpacked that obviously plays into things like events that obviously matter and the interpretations thereof, such as September 11th, the ongoing war of terror, the Iraq War. And so the left, some of the elements on the left who are completely unabashed in talking about racism on the right and the white supremacist system, still have never even mentioned the word Jewish supremacism or Jewish power. And I understand as a Jewish person or someone who identifies as, I have there's an ethnic Jewish aspect to my background, and yet even that is sort of interesting in relationship to the matrilineal dynamics that have been clearly defined by holding land in the Jewish state. That it's a matrilineal thing, and it's my mom's mom is a Mexican American and family from Mexico, and Catholic upbringing in that quarter of my background. But it's also, my Jewishness is related to what I perceived as what I've positively got from my Jewish family, which involves things like the critical and dialogical approach to life and politics, and where everything needs to be on the table, and we need to have conversations even when they are uncomfortable or even when we disagree. And then on my own, I have a strong predilection for the spiritual, and so there are aspects of the Jewish tradition, the prophetic part of the Jewish tradition, that in many ways look like they are standing up to tyranny in all its forms. And a lot of times it looks like the tyranny that people who identified themselves as Jews faced was from their own leadership, their own elite, their own cognitive elite, their own rabbinical elite. And this continues. And so I would ask the people of good faith on the left, who have a much stronger interpretation of the very real dynamics of race and power, to and maybe this is my Jewish privilege coming out, but to help we, the Jews of good conscience and good faith, who have a psychopathic, in many ways, a sadistic, internal cognitive elite that use the issues of terrorism and the threats of anti-Jewishness, termed anti-Semitism, to corral and control the mind of the Jewish diaspora. And when you're in the era of the actual Jewish state, when you can see the full outlines of the deep Jewish state, which includes the Israeli intelligence networks, which includes the Talpiot program, which includes intergenerational plans to dominate our security and software sectors, and is tied into the most intensely tyrannical surveillance architecture globally that we've ever seen before, that when you have that in combination what I've termed the Jewish deep state, which is the global Jewish crime syndicates that are interlocked and work in relationship to aspects of the Jewish state and the deep Jewish state, or the Jewish deep state. I'm losing my I'm losing my own terminology, but it's a conceptual thing that we need to be able to understand, and that we need help unpacking here. And I would ask the good faith elements of the left, who don't want to have an interpretation that's either sort of what they see as too focused around individuals or specific families, or is anti-Jewish, or is racist in some, against people of darker skin in some sectors, that they don't want to be aligned with that, which I completely understand. I don't want to be aligned with that either. But you can't just have a vacuum. You can't just you basically allowed that to be the only place that helps deal with the problem of obvious Jewish supremacy, and the problem of Jewish privilege, and the way that it plays out in controlling discourse on the left, and most intensely around the role of Israel in American politics. So the left is guilty it's an absence. It's the presence of an absence there, where they have failed to do not only a non-racist but an anti-racist analysis based on facts that are completely in line with the principles of their suspicion about economic power and it being run through capitalist interests and capitalist networks, to actually unpack the aspects that are ethno-religiously based in all of that. So step up, left.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, and this is where we're going to have to. This is where a lot of people are going to have to make decisions at some point. Whether in the case of particularly, I can see a case of what seems to be a very real possibility with this current administration. That could be the possible event of another major false flag type terror event on par with something like a September 11th, or at least some of the attacks that have taken place in Europe in recent months, and a lot of these people are going to have to make a decision on which side they're going to align on, and I think that decision is ultimately going to historically seal the legacy of a lot of these people in these circles that we are talking about. A lot of people, I think their legacies are going to be defined by the decisions they make here in the coming years regarding which side they want to come down on in this conversation, the things we've just talked about. Now, I want to move on to, and this is related to what you just talked about, actually. Your most last statement was a good segue into this article that we're about to talk about here from the Daily Forward by Peter Beinart, titled "Beware the Jewish Republicans Who Embrace Far-Right Bigotry." And in this article, Peter Beinart focuses on Ohio Republican State Treasurer, Senate candidate in the state of Ohio, Republican Josh Mandel, Jewish Republican in Ohio, who has been putting out statements and social media posts that are aligning with the overtly anti-Muslim, anti-Islam sentiment that has increasingly crept its way into the mainstream of the Republican Party. He's put out tweets supporting Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec after the ADL put them on a list of prominent leaders in both the alt-right and the alt-light who peddle in hatred in the terms of the ADL. And also, he's also sponsored, he's championed, provingly talked about Geert Wilders wanting to close mosques and ban the Quran, and he's even retweeted the Center for Security Policy, which is Frank Gaffney's think tank, and even tweeted about how Ohio mosques are chaining kids to walls and beating them for not reading the Quran. So Peter Beinart is very, very sad, it appears, that this Jewish Republican is identifying with these anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiments. And in this article, it appears that Beinart breaks down how the previous era of what we've described as the paleo neocons openly and publicly promoted treating Islam and treating Muslims with respect. It's what I like to call the whole idea of it's okay to kill, the concept of it's okay to kill millions of people as long as you say nice things about them while you're killing them. Wanting to kill millions of people but saying mean things about them while you kill them, that's just unacceptable. But it's okay as long as you say nice things about them. And Peter Beinart, it really appears he's lamenting the loss of the old school neocons like Bill Kristol and David Frum and others who could be reliably counted upon to say nice things about the people whose deaths they're advocating for in the thousands and millions, whereas now the current generation cannot be trusted to say nice things about the people they're killing. And so this is once again indicative of the shift in the split between like the neocon factions we've identified, whereas the paleo neocons we described them, Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, Max Boot, David Frum types are more in line with somebody like a Peter Beinart, I think, in this neoliberal establishment, although Peter Beinart sometimes will take his criticism of Israel a little further than a lot of neoliberals will. But in terms of, I think that they're much more in line with their policies as far as being in line with the DC consensus on foreign policy and a lot of aspects of domestic policy than these paleo neocons are with this new crowd that has come to prominence in the age of Trump. And Beinart mentions that this rhetoric in general, these sentiments have become much more entrenched within the mainstream of the Republican Party as they were in the past, whereas these elements have always had influence, but they were more or less on the fringes of the Republican Party. The mainstream, and it's moving further and further into that direction. And we talked about this earlier. The questions you asked Robert David Steele about the possibility of another aspect of the deep state aiding Donald Trump's presidential victory, perhaps, and using perhaps even less than ethical means of achieving that, of making that happen. And what this does, this shift in the Republican Party to the right, much like there's been a shift in the Democratic Party to the left, as evidenced by the rise of Bernie Sanders and other, quote, populists within the Democratic Party. This is not something, though, that happened overnight with the Republicans. And what I believe is that I think that there has been an identification that there's going to be this shift to the right within the thinking of the Republican base in terms of immigration, in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of a lot of these social issues which have direct impact on these matters related to immigration and multiculturalism. And I think that the seeds have been in place for this for a long time. We can look back with the benefit of hindsight and see that the Tea Party, in a lot of ways, was the test drive for the Trump presidency, with a figure like Sarah Palin representing what you may call a prototype for a Donald Trump presidency, with her testing the waters with a lot of the criticism of Islam and Muslims, and making it more about just an actual war against Islam rather than just a war against the terrorists, which is what the paleo neocons like to portray it as. And even in the trenches who was in the trenches during the Tea Party days putting out the propaganda films? It was a man like Steve Bannon, who, of course, was Andrew Breitbart's right-hand man at the time, and now, of course, is the chief strategist, playing the role of Karl Rove to Donald Trump's George W. Bush. And it was Bannon. Not only was he putting out films against Islam, he was also putting out films vilifying the Occupy Wall Street movement and in favor of just all this, involved in efforts for unlimited cash and campaign contributions to some of these outlets that are directly connected with Breitbart, such as Citizens United did. And, of course, there's a Sheldon Adelson connection to that as well. And you want to get into hyper right-wing Zionism, it doesn't get any more extreme than Sheldon Adelson. So this has been a long time in coming. The Tea Party served as this prototype where I believe the realization was there that the Republican base is shifting to the right on these matters, and that we're going to need a Republican Party and Republican representatives in the public eye who will meet and who will be able to meet the concerns of the conservative base that is rapidly moving to the right as they see more and more the effects, the economic effects of mass immigration, and the effects that the immigration and trade policies have on the job market and on the economy. And, of course, the migrant and immigrant population from Mexico and from Latin America is being scapegoated as being the source of the problems rather than the symptom of the problems, which are not, of course, being adequately addressed by these people on the hard right. And you move on, of course, even the destruction of countries such as Iraq and Libya and Syria, which has created this refugee crisis, which has definitely entrenched Europe, more so than here in the States, but definitely as played a shift in the rightward thinking in Europe with all of the, quote, populists, the rise of the populists in Europe, such as Nigel Farage and the forces which made Brexit possible, which, of course, Breitbart played a huge role in creating the propaganda campaign for Brexit by establishing its London branch. And other countries, France and the Le Pen candidacy. Germany's got a major election with the right-wing party gaining traction there. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, and Hungary, of course, where there was a recent controversy in Hungary over the government putting out an anti-George Soros campaign, and the Netanyahu government basically refused to condemn the anti-Soros campaign, much to the dismay of many Jewish groups throughout the West. So we've seen this rise of this populist movement here in the U.S. and throughout Europe, and I think it's been identified amongst elements within the deep state, within these power structure, with these power influence peddling entities and think tanks that there is going to be the shift and we need to be on top of it, and how best to take advantage of this shift to the right and in a way that benefits Israel, that benefits Zionism, continues to keep alive the basic myths of this war on terrorism. And that, of course, is where a key element of bringing in the Alex Jones InfoWars conspiracy-oriented crowd into this fold. And so this is a long time coming, and roles of data mining groups like Cambridge Analytica, which data mine the voters and the thoughts and the beliefs of the base of this movement, which elected Donald Trump, as well as those who voted for Brexit, and getting an understanding of where they're coming from and why they feel the way they do about these matters, and how best to manipulate the narrative in a way that continues to be beneficial to this hard hyper-Zionist, and at the same time hyper-nationalist ideology worldview. And so this article that Beinart wrote in detailing the shift to the right, I believe, is not something that was just done by accident. This is a manufactured reaction, and this shift to the right, I believe, has been taken advantage of, and in a lot of ways co-opted by these forces, which seem to lead back to Israel and the Benjamin Netanyahu government, as best represented by outlets such as Breitbart and Drudge Report and Gateway Pundit, to name a few, and as well as Rebel Media, to name a few.
Well, I think that was a very thorough analysis of this, and I think it is a very interesting understanding, and it could be very important to clarify what the different interests are here, and it makes a lot of sense to step in the fold of this disagreement between what's really paleo neocons and the new neocons, or the neocon 2.0, that are both heavily involved in Jewish state politics, and there's pretty much no disagreement about how important that is to any of them. We need to force the people like Peter Beinart to talk about other options, other populisms. Let's even say a populism of the radical middle. A transpartisan populism that's principled and pragmatic, and offers a next generation vision about politics that's philosophically based, that may give a lot of the old arguments a rest, and actually dare to think for itself, and not imagine that whether it's whether it's the Austrian school or the Marxists, that maybe European men, many of them Jewish at times, from the 1800s, maybe they didn't have the monopoly on political understanding, and definitely didn't have the monopoly on political vision. And so I think there's a whole new open source political regime that is in a nascent phase of beginning to express itself. And these kind of sort of fairly false disagreements, I mean, they are disagreeing on the surface, but the underlying agreement is so substantive and so violently destructive, as you so well laid out, about the difference, in terms of, okay, is this a policy of destroying the lives of millions of Semitic dark-skinned people in an openly racial or Islamophobic way, or is it in a more civil and cloaked way, and it's just justified by the war on terror, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of destroyed lives and the many destroyed nations at this point are the poisonous fruit of that fake discussion. And I agree with you completely about that. And at the same time, someone like Peter Beinart, and going back to our previous conversation, people like Glenn Greenwald and Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton hold up the left wing of the war of terror fraud and its violently destructive anti-Semitic consequences that have been proven out. And so that is not the scope of the political debate that I think we need to allow the public to rest in. Let's advance the discourse. Let's culture jam. Let's intellectually jam the conversation into places that transcend these discussions between paleo neocons and new neocons.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is related. This is another good segue into, I think this might be the last topic we discuss in depth here, and that is this article that Philip Giraldi linked to on his Facebook page. And he said that based on this article, he can see the possibility of war with Iran breaking out in under a year under Trump. And this is a pretty big step for someone like Philip Giraldi to take, who has been more in the, I think, a more pro-Trump, or at least an optimistic outlook on a Donald Trump presidency, certainly as compared to someone like Hillary Clinton. And for Giraldi to come out and say something like this, I think, is a huge deal. And of course, we have talked among ourselves that if Philip Giraldi could come out and identify this Steve Bannon, Breitbart, MAGA wing, which is closely affiliated with people like Sebastian Gorka and Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, who you confronted about the Iran nuclear deal on C-SPAN, actually, back in 2015. If someone like Philip Giraldi could come out and identify this wing as being the ones that are pushing for this, to rip up this Iran deal and actually intensify the conflict and really take it up several notches to a point to where it could not be taken under Obama or perhaps under President Hillary Clinton, I think that would be a huge step. And anyway, this article that Giraldi linked to, titled "The Mask is Off, Trump is Seeking War with Iran," it's by Trita Parsi. And in this article, it gets into how Trump, over any objections that his, I guess Trump and his people that are on his side in this whole Iran deal debate, which would be particularly Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, and Mike Pompeo, names are particularly mentioned. They've been mentioned by other outlets, including Front Page Magazine, which is David Horowitz, which has a sympathetic view to this anti-Iran deal narrative here, agenda. So, and in this article, it breaks down how Trump really this has been documented in other articles, including, I believe Bloomberg talked about this. There's an article in Bloomberg about how Trump nearly ripped up the deal, and also in Foreign Policy. And so Trump, against the objections of who Trita Parsi labels from this Foreign Policy article as being identified as the adults in the room. That's referring to Rex Tillerson, James Madison, H.R. McMaster. Trump was upset that they did not come up with the basis to rip up the deal. And so now we've got another 90-day period where it really appears that Trump himself is putting pressure on these people who are holding out against ripping up the deal to find a justification for it.
Yes, and as many of us were pointing out during the actual election campaign, that Trump got into the race, of course, by focusing on the Iran deal and how bad it was. And it's in this area of Iran that Trump looks like he looks very clearly like he owes somebody something, or he's compromised in some way, because I doubt that he really is personally committed to how bad the Iran deal is. That's something else going on there. And as he laid out some of these articles, and also there's this article on the Loeb blog by Trita Parsi that says the mask.
This is the article, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
this one, yeah. The mask is off, Trump is seeking war with Iran, and that it's, like you said, it's obvious there's these different, crews that are just trying to help Trump figure out how to rip up the Iran deal and pursue aggression in the best way possible. So again, we're seeing another false divide in many ways, whether it's the Pompeo, Gorka, Bannon group, as you said, or whether it's the Mattis, Tillerson, maybe Kelly, and Who is
Thinking of McMaster? You're thinking of
Oh,
McMaster.
McMaster, yes. Whether they're actually trying to help Trump and his sort of tantrumy ways figure out the more effective way to, in a dishonorable and unlawful fashion, find a way to destroy the deal with Iran in a way that can actually be used to then put the blame on Iran and sort of this is a similar type of scenario to the run-up to the Iraq aggressive war. So we need everybody with their eyes on this, and this is going to take some Trump supporters who have been compromised in relationship to calling out Trump's obviously negative parts to step into the fold if they do not want to see the nation of Iran bombed and attacked. And that is not a wise thing to do. So that would include people like the Cernoviches all the way to the Alex Joneses. It's time for them to step up, even if they are controlled or agents of some sort. It's who wants the world to go up in flames and for innocent Iranian people's lives to be destroyed?
Yes, absolutely. And we don't hold out, and I want to say I don't hold out the possibility that a lot of this is theater, that this is just a lot of this is exaggerated. I feel that way a lot of the time with North Korea as well. But we do need to take this very, very seriously. And I think it's with because everyone from the alt-right to the alt-light, whichever side you fall on, and we've documented this before, no one really is paying attention to exactly just how nefarious this Steve Bannon, Breitbart, MAGA wing is that got Trump elected. And everybody, even in terms of foreign policy, even people with principled foreign policy beliefs, still focus on the Russia-Syria issue, where it appears that Trump is actually really bringing down the conflict in Syria and is turning away from the policies of arming the rebels, which led to the destabilization of the country. And people are focusing on that and they're applauding him, as opposed to an H.R. McMaster who appears to have the opposite agenda for Syria and wants to continue arming rebels to destabilize and ultimately bring down the Assad government. But on the other hand, you've got a situation here where McMaster is taking, at least on the surface, a much more sensible view, if this is to be believed, when it comes to the Iran deal than Donald Trump is making. So with all the focus on Syria and what people like Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka and various others might believe about Syria, it's almost an old example of the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's going to hit you with. And while they're saying while they might have some of the what people would perceive to be the right views about Syria, they're advocating the more militaristic approach for Iran and also North Korea. And I think the thing that needs to be looked out the most with this is the fact that under Donald Trump, a lot of things I think could possibly be done that could not be done under a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama or a status quo Republican. And the most worrisome aspect to me is the fact that Trump and the Trump presidency has got so much of the quote alternative media behind it, to the point where even people who in the past could not are trying to credibly sell the idea that Donald Trump has to launch a preemptive military strike on North Korea because it's the necessary evil, because the Clintons and the globalists have allowed North Korea to acquire these weapons, and Kim is a madman, and Trump's hands are being tied, and he has to do it. So with these kind of rationales being put out, as well as someone like a Jerome Corsi, who we've identified, who's written books about the imminent threat that Iran's nuclear weapons program presents, as of being an official employee of InfoWars and actually serving as the InfoWars DC press correspondent. Yeah, we have a reason to be very concerned about this stuff, but we need to continue shedding light on the nefariousness of this Bannon, Breitbart, America First entity, which really did get Donald Trump elected, and what they actually appear to represent on foreign policy. And we also cannot dismiss the possibility that, this is what was, and this is just speculation here, but we've always wondered, we talked about how Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka nothing has been done about them. Nowhere even close to a real effort to remove them from the Trump administration has been put in place, despite their alleged anti-Semitism. Remember all the stuff about Steve Bannon and how Trump's bringing an anti-Semite in to be his Karl Rove and all the controversy that caused. And meanwhile, it was the hard right Zionist groups that are the most militantly opposed to the Iran deal and seem to be the most militantly hawkish when it comes to Iran that backed him, that were 100% behind Steve Bannon getting into the position he's in, and makes you wonder what promises have been made, what promises have been made with regards to Israel. Remember that Steve Bannon is the one who was the top voice in the administration, along with Nikki Haley and David Friedman, the ambassador, pushing Trump to move the embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. And it also turns out Bannon's the one in Trump's ear urging him to tear up the nuclear deal. What promises, what possible promises were made if this new establishment here that's represented within the Breitbart nexus in terms of media and influence over the public discourse, what promises were made in exchange for helping Donald Trump get in the White House? What does Donald Trump know? What does Steve Bannon know? What do these people know? Were there any promises made potentially? And if so, what are the consequences of these deals? Are there deals going on behind the scenes where certain promises were made to make certain things happen? We don't know, but I think it's definitely worth debating. And
yes, I agree, and I am there. These are very important points, and there are more to be made about this. But I apologize that I have to bring this to a close right now, and I apologize if I've been a little bit distracted in the last section here, because there's decisions that I need to make in the next hour and input that I need to give in relationship to this Kansas City arrest case. So I need to bring this to a close right now. But I think that some of these issues that you brought up are very important, and then we should expand on them and go even deeper in the future. But thank you so much, Greg, for having this conversation with
and
me.
thank you for the interview with Steele and the perspective and analysis you've given on all these matters today. So anyway, until next time, we'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.